This afternoon we've got two sessions taking place, one in conjunction with EIC and one in conjunction with RICS, looking at sustainability, responsible business, energy efficiency in the context of facilities management, property management and linkage with energy management team. I've been involved in these sessions now with MEUC for 3 years now. This is my third year of doing it. And we always get a good debate that takes place in terms of understanding the roles that we have between the energy management profession and how we deliver that into operational buildings and get to see some of the results and the returns coming through from both the property management teams and the facilities management teams as well. I'm going to hand over now to Matthew. He's going to take us through the first session.
Okay, thanks, Sunil. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Sunil says, thank you for staying to the, I'm going to say the bitter end. That's not the right phrase at all, is it? So I'm Matthew Farrow. I'm director of a trade association called the Environmental Industries Commission. And what I'm going to do just to get this session underway is just talk through a few slides to give a bit of sort of policy context to the world of energy management and facilities management. And that will then take us into a panel discussion where we can talk about what it's like at the front line, some of the frontline issues within that policy context. First of all, though, conscious many of you may not be familiar with the EIC, so we're a very broad church trade association, basically representing environmental companies, a mixture of consultancies, environmental technology providers, about 160 member companies. We also have university members, so a real sort of bit wide sustainability mix. And worth also saying, as well as energy management, energy efficiency, we cover pretty much all environmental topics. So air quality, water quality, contaminated land, so the full range of sustainability challenges. And the first sort of observation I'll make, I think, might be relevant, actually comes out of the work we've done on sort of broad environmental protection. So you've got the Climate Change Committee, which is the main driving force, I guess, driving government policy around energy management, buildings, and so forth. And then you've got a whole sort of DEFRA agenda around traditional environmental issues. And that agenda has been transformed since Mr. Gove took office. And he's pushing a pretty ambitious framework in a new environment bill, which should be laid in Parliament probably in a couple of months' time, basically saying post-Brexit, when we don't have the EU to actually enforce environmental standards and targets on the UK, we need to create a new legal framework. And underpinning that framework is a post-Brexit green watchdog, the snappily titled Office of Environmental Protection, which Gove has decided, bit of a surprise I think in many ways, should actually have the power to hold ministers to account, to take legal action against ministers if they're not hitting air quality targets or water quality targets or whatever. And already there's a bit of a groundswell of people saying, well, hang on the energy side, the Climate Change Committee doesn't have those powers. It can advise the government, it can say policy's not working, we need tougher building standards or whatever, but it can't force anything through. And I think you're going to see a bit of a battle when the bill goes to Parliament about how this new green watchdog fits with the CCC. And I think a lot of the NGOs are hoping they can actually force government to give the CCC, or the OEP itself perhaps, actual tough powers on climate change enforcement. So just worth keeping an eye on that, I think, as we go forward. In the meantime, though, if you think about the current set of building energy management policies we have, I guess the first conclusion you've got to draw is no one really thinks it's working very well. So this is the Climate Change Committee's sort of view. And this is one of their sort of standard slides they do, where the bottom line is the emissions trajectory for all buildings. We have to be on that trajectory, they think, to meet the 2050 climate change targets. Of course, those targets might be made even tougher. The green line is, well, the top line, then the black line is where we're going to get without any policy. The green line is lower risk policies already in place. They shave off a few emissions. The yellow block is then policies that they think are in place, maybe tough to actually have much effect though. And then the red block is where there's no policy at all. So they're saying policy framework we have isn't enough, it's got to be strengthened. And if you actually ask those of you who live with this stuff day to day. So this is a slide from one of the EVE surveys on energy efficiency trends. That survey goes out both to the energy efficiency supply side, but also energy users. And a bit hard to interpret, but the key thing is the red and the yellow are those people who think policy isn't working, it's not effective. And as you can see, certainly from 2015 on, more and more people feel the current policy setup just isn't working particularly well. I guess that leads on to a question, why is it so difficult? Why is it so hard for governments who say the right thing, have tough climate change targets, to deliver a framework that we can all work within? I think a couple of reasons that strike me. One is, as we all know, it's a low political priority. You rarely get ministers who are that enthused by it. David Cameron had a big meeting when he was Prime Minister with all the NGOs, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, RSPB, etc., on environmental policy. And they pushed him on this and they said, come on, we want more energy efficiency action from the government. And allegedly he threw up his hands and he said, look, everyone agrees energy efficiency is a good thing, but none of you know how to do it in practice. No one knows how to actually change the game, as it were. I think Claire Perry's given a bit more sort of momentum to this agenda, but politically not really seen as a priority. I think secondly, we just had this mix of EU measures from the, the big EU directives that we've implemented, but debate about not wanting to gold plate them, plus we've had homegrown stuff like CRC and so on. That mix of policies has rarely worked together that well. It's confusing for business energy users in the industry. I think thirdly, poor data. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but a lot of data is produced and collected in different little bundles perhaps, but it's very difficult to get comprehensive data on building energy use across different sectors. That makes it hard, I think, for government or business to work out the right thing to do. And then I think lastly, there's an ongoing struggle the government has to, on the one hand, not make policy too complicated so people can understand, plan, work with it. And on the other hand, to make it realistic in terms of adapting to real world problems that people have. And I always think the CRC is a good example of this. So the CRC about to be put out of its misery, I think at the end of this month. I remember when it came in, I was running the CBI's energy and environment team at the time. And it was devised by, I think, DEFRA initially, then DEC took it over when they were formed. And the idea, which had a lot of support, and CBI was very supportive, was that the industrial energy users were doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of carbon reduction, and there should be a scheme for the public sector, the commercial sector, and DEFRA DEC came up with this idea of a fairly classic trading scheme with a cap and so on. And then what happened was, as they went into the implementation phase, there'd been an economic crash by that time, of course, 2008, and lots of different sectors said, look, this isn't easy for us. The franchise companies said, we have a franchise model. All our franchises are too small to be included. They should be out of it. You had companies investing in on-site renewables saying, we want credits in the league tables for that, as well as the rocks we can sell them with. And gradually, a bit of ground was given, more tweaks were made. And then, of course, people came along and said it's too complicated. And that sort of headline, fairly typical stuff. This is a too complicated a policy, it should be scrapped. The Treasury then said it's got to be a tax anyway. And what started off as a pretty straightforward policy with good intentions just fell between these two stools of complexity and simplicity, trying to do the right thing by real-world companies, trying to be manageable, and no one was happy at all in the end. So I think there's some real challenges out there. Just to finish off, though, with a few thoughts about what EIC is thinking about in this area. We have a very active carbon management and sustainable buildings group, which Sunil chairs, and we've been looking at the mix of policies and how you might evolve it. And I guess the overall theme is that rather than revolution, let's go for evolution. So rather than scrapping a lot of the stuff we've got, let's try and make it work better, try and make it fit better together. So the first thing was EPCs. Lots of issues and debates about EPCs. Not all buildings that should have them do have them. The modelling often is quite challenging, should we say. It doesn't cover all energy use in a building. But they're pretty well known, pretty well understood as a concept. So we think we need to keep them, improve their accuracy, and reduce the validity rate from the current 10 years to 5 years, because 10 years is too long. Secondly, MEES, it's a recent policy, We think that should be extended over time and used to actually force through an upgrade of the energy efficiency of the building stock over the coming decades in line with carbon targets. So we're saying by 2030, EPC-C is a minimum standard, and also using these at the point of sale as well as rental. And then you can see 2040, 2050 high standards, but building owners, building occupiers, developers can plan ahead over that sort of time scale. And then other proposals, ESOS, I think, needs to be made tough and needs to be reformed. We're suggesting it should become part of companies' annual report, so it's more transparent. We're also interested in the Dutch model, where there's pressure put on companies to go for the quick payback opportunities that ESOS reports have revealed. World-leading standards of non-domestic new build, pretty straightforward. Next one, getting some financial incentives in the system, linking a portion of business rates or stamp duty to EPC ratings, self-explanatory. DECs, DECs, we think they're a pretty important data source. They're actually trying to capture live operational data. So we don't want those to be abolished. We think they're worth persevering with, and we think we should be extending them beyond public buildings to commercial buildings. And data is a key issue as we see it. I say a lot of different data is collected, but we need to phase out non-digital data collection. We need a much more centralized, probably anonymized hub, if you like, database of building energy efficiency, energy management, data and metrics to allow a lot more insights and benchmarking that the industry and users can make use of. And then lastly, enforcement. I think most people would agree that enforcement doesn't work particularly well. It's usually local authorities' trading standards that are supposed to enforce DECs, EPCs and the like. We did some freedom of information requests of all councils in England and found that almost without exception, none of them are actually actively enforcing or levying fines for non-display of EPCs or non-use of DECs. If you look at the last slide, again, this survey is from an Eves report where we work with them on some policy questions. Both users and suppliers feel enforcement is just not effective or a major cause of concern. And of course, good companies doing the right thing means they feel they're being penalized by the people who are not bothering to comply. And so one of the ideas we had was perhaps to link that sort of enforcement to the land registry. So when property is registered, it's also required to show compliance with energy management, energy efficiency standards, and that embeds a much more rigorous approach. So those were the sort of proposals that we've been putting forward. I think interested to have a discussion both with the panel and with you in the audience as well about, with that policy framework, how does facilities management and energy management, how can they work together to make the sort of progress we need? What I'm going to start off by doing, I think, is just asking each panel member in turn for any reactions to those slides and to the sort of policy framework. I mean, Sunil, you've chaired the group for several years. You were involved in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. I can't really disagree with it, can I?
Interesting if you did. But
I think the challenges.
Are we going to get there? Do you think the sort of?
Yeah, I think the challenges that we've got is we're getting to a different level of conversation now. Up until this point, we've had lots of regulation that's been based upon theoretical information, modelled information, an understanding of what the data is telling us, because we've never actually had accurate in-use data beforehand. We're now starting to collect a lot of that actual information, and the actual information that we're getting is slightly different to the theoretical information, which is what everyone expected anyway. But we've now got a different premise of how we set policy. And we've got a cleaning of the decks. We're trying to remove a lot of the historic regulations, start to build them in together. We're moving ahead with a twin-pronged approach of MEES on one hand, ESOS on the other hand, as linked major regulatory pieces. What we can do with that is saying, if we have actual data, what does that mean? And so some of the challenges, and Rich can talk a bit more about this, is what does that mean for things like building regulations and changing of the building regulations pieces? So the SAP, SBEMS, etc., which are used for the calculations, should they also be updated? So there's lots of things that we're now starting to talk about, which we wouldn't have been able to do 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, with the new set of information that we've got.
Richard, see a project. Nice intro there. You're also a member of the EIC group.
I am also a member of the working group. Thanks for that kind of pass on Part L. Thank you for that. So, in terms of Part L, so I have attended some working groups with the Climate Change Committee, and they were looking at Part L, and in particular things like the definition of zero carbon, and other things to do with the SBEM modelling. And I'm getting a little bit technical, but the big gap at the moment is obviously we assess carbon almost in two ways. We have this what's called regulated power and unregulated power. And because of that big gap, what's happening is that obviously in terms of regulation, we're getting to the point where actually, you know, I was talking to someone actually just over lunch actually, and they were talking about the fact that in their house, they don't really have to turn the heating on anymore. That's the kind of position we kind of get to with regulated power. The problem is we now have this great huge amount of unregulated power that we're not actually doing anything about particularly. You know, the Xbox, the TV, and those kind of usages are going up. And there is a lot of talk about how we can deal with that. The latest we had in our working group, when Bayes and MHCLG were there, was actually they weren't going to do anything about it, actually, to be fair. And that is probably the challenge for, I suppose, us as professionals, is how we drive energy efficiency when a large part of the energy efficiency is stuff we're completely ignoring. It's the TV, it's the Xbox and that kind of stuff, really. So, bit of a précis on Part L, I suppose.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Thoughts from your presentation. I thought one of the most striking things that came out to me was the potential to give more powers on environmental regulation teeth, really, because I think the discussion around regulation and having those teeth to back it up seems to be quite prevalent within conferences. It was a very big discussion in an IEMA conference where Gove was there a couple of weeks ago. So I think it's quite an exciting period, actually, when we start to look at these talks about how government can be held accountable for the actions that they're taking. And when you look at that and compare it to what's been spoken on at the UN level, there's a lot of talk about accountability and being accountable for your actions as well. So quite exciting, I think.
So it seems to me we've got sort of two themes coming out, haven't we? We've got quite a lot of maybe hopeful activity at the sort of policy level, that government internationally, nationally taking it more seriously, more powers for regulators, a possibility perhaps to try and bring together this disparate bundle of different policies we have. But then at the sort of practical level on the front line, I guess it's not going to work unless the data is right, the modelling is right, we're looking at the right things in buildings, and I guess that's the challenge, isn't it? Is the policy level and the sort of technical level going to move in the same way? Is there anything which, as a profession we can be doing to try and join it up more? And I guess EIC is partly trying to provide that link between policy people and the people on the front line, but...
I think that there is. So from an operational perspective, so if we talk about this from a property management perspective as well, so we know that there is a massive gap that exists between what a building could be performing at and what it does actually perform at. Estimates are somewhere between a 20 to 70% gap that exists as part of that. So you can get towards the top ends from refurbishment changes, etc., and the low ends. So we've got new technologies coming out, use of AI technologies, which goes in, does some deep dives in, understands the behavioural analytics of what goes on in the building, and then works in conjunction with the building management system, some of the behavioural elements as well, to make those tweaks and those changes as well. So if you were to move towards an organisation, say, we could save 20% of the energy from your business. We could connect into that the ability of self-generation. We could connect battery power, etc., to be able to then manage as part of how that works. And all of that would pay back in 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. It's surprising how few organisations would say, okay, let's investigate that further. And I think that's the gap. The technology is getting there. We have proofs that are starting to come through. We don't have enough willingness from an organisation saying, I'll even look at a 3-year payback. We work with some organisations which are looking at 18-month paybacks, 12-month paybacks. And in that vein, you're not going to get very far. You'll look for the small tweaks and changes, etc. But you're not going to be looking at some of the big, the 5, 10, 15, 20% changes that will come through. So it's how do we get that incentivisation that says the technology is there? How do we then push that out so that organisations have to respond? Now, whether the next change of ESOS and SCCR provides that as a mechanism that says anything less than a X year payback, you have to explain why you didn't do it. We're not going to tell you that you have to. That's up to you. It's a business decision, but you need to provide that rationale in an open public domain so it's understood. So there's some of these drivers that are starting to come through from that.
What do people in the room think? Is that we're getting towards some big changes if policy is toughening, and as Sunil says, the technology is there? Is the motivation in companies to, at the right sort of levels, I guess, to act on some of this?
One of the things is it will move it away from just being a data gathering exercise, a tax collection exercise, to actually doing something with it. And that comes back to CRC isn't dead, it's still there. You still have to do all of that mind-numbing reporting.
Yeah.
It's just you don't have to write a check at the end of it. And now lots more people have to pay that CRC, but it's hidden in their bill. So it's fundamentally a retrograde thing to do. But I think, so the point is, anything that moves it from just being gathering the data to being something that is making people do something with it, that works. But not forcing them to do it, but forcing them to explain themselves. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, so nudge there, I guess. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, please.
I'll take an example. We've got one of the biggest states, sorry, so we've got 500,000 square feet buildings of various ages. And the one that really upsets me is costing 5 times as much per cubic metre to heat as the newest one. It's pre-war. It serves a purpose at the moment to do anything at all about the insulation of it, to spray and foam and the roof and all sorts of things, would be a 10-year payback probably. We're likely to knock it down within those 10 years. But it just doesn't justify at the moment knocking it down and putting a new one in, particularly if the new one's going to be more expensive because of tougher building regulations. So I'm sure lots of people are in that dilemma where they've got very old buildings that really, it's too expensive to do anything with, but it's not so useless that you say, well, knock it down and get rid of it.
Yeah, they're getting into the latter stages of their life, but they still have some years of remaining use. Yeah, is that, please?
I believe that the latest Finance Act 2019 has really brought back what used to be known as the industrial building allowance, a certain formula that's different in some respect, whereby there's an opportunity to get tax incentives for new builds and for renovations. So it's a very interesting to look at. So there's a possibility of those things being utilised. You also have, in some respect, depending upon the type of asset, you've got industrial annual investment allowances, depending on the size of the company, you're using. I think it's good enough now to £1 million, depending on when this work is carried out. But there's a variety of changes recently coming up in the latest Finance Act.
And do we have in the corner? Do we have a?
I haven't heard of NEES. What's that stand for?
Minimum energy
Efficiency standard.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the reasons for looking at a trajectory is that obviously what we don't want people to do is to refurbish things twice. If you know that the standard is going to go up, you want to hit the standard that's going to be in 5, 10, whatever years' time, rather than the one that is here now, so that the landlord is actually able to plan for that eventuality. Say, well, I need to do a deep refurbishment now, rather than just, let's say, do the low-hanging fruit because it gets me through for 5 years, which might be the option in some scenarios where you just want the building to last another 5 years. But the idea is to at least allow landlords to plan for that eventuality. They'll know that, you know, if they spend the money, they need to spend it on to reach that minimum standard. So those minimum standards are run by the EPC that we were talking about before, which again goes back a little bit to some of this energy modelling.
Yep. So the MEES is based upon the rating that you get from your energy performance certificate, and it says that an F4G rated building has to be upgraded and has to be improved to remain lettable as a building. And so that's when you get into the MEES regulation, is the process mechanisms and the ways out of it that exist for that regulation.
It's a classic piece of government legislation. It's a very good idea, but when you actually try and implement something, it's a blunt tool, so therefore you have to introduce exemptions. And as soon as you introduce the exemptions, it actually almost becomes meaningless, because there's so many exemptions. You can turn around and say, well, actually, it's not economically viable to do it. So, you know, a lot of people say it's not economically viable. And there's obviously exemptions for historic buildings and all sorts of stuff. So by the time you've gone through that process, there's a lot of ways out. So it's not as it was a good idea, and hopefully it will still be a good idea, but there are lots of ways out of it.
And that was one of our recommendations, wasn't it, to sort of close some of those loopholes with MEES, because it's just...
It's a bit of a name and shame at the moment, so you can kind of go on a register to say I haven't done it because I didn't want to, because it wasn't economically viable. But that's the only penalty, really, in that regard. It's a bigger penalty if you don't actually do it at all. It's be up to about 150,000, I think, but that's kind of the process.
Would you say the transparency angle?
So I work in the public sector for the Army, which is undergoing a huge rationalisation of a really ancient estate, which is basically mainly Victorian or 60s, so in both camps inefficient. And we really, you know, my sort of senior boss is you might think unusually ambitious in this respect. He's a 2-star general. But you know, there's no real persuader there. You know, so how can we put stuff into business cases? We say we must have the through life view of this building. You know, so the what we call the ARDA, or called the OPEX costs, all through the building, so we can say actually spending all this money up front on the best GM standards is worth it. Well, you can't really. You can come up with all sorts of metrics about carbon, but I think we're all just holding our breath until a carbon tax is introduced, because then we go, wow, bang, we can't avoid it. And a carbon tax is not unreasonable. It's completely, it's an end of pipe tax. You know, we taxed emissions from end of pipe, from industrial, when we were aware of how much industrial effluent knackered rivers. Now we're aware how much energy effluent knackers the planet. I'm not being idealistic and saying it how it is. We've cleaned up our rivers. Carbon tax is the only way to do it. It's an anti-social thing to do, and in a society we don't do anti-social things. So I think that's where we have to go.
I think that's what CRC was originally.
But we can have, no, but if it's across everything, it's,
Yeah.
You know, we can have fiddles in the transitional stage, which will just run out because things will change and then they'll become irrelevant.
The problem is, I suppose it's easy for us as professionals in the energy field and energy efficiency and all that kind of stuff to talk about these things and say we need a carbon tax. I'm going to defend government a little bit here, not because I want to, but obviously, you know, there was a big fuss about the steel industry not so long ago. So if we introduce a carbon tax, what would actually be said we were doing was displacing our carbon and just giving it to someone else. So i.e. we don't make steel in this country, we make it in China, which doesn't have a carbon tax. So there's always that conflict for a central government, in effect, in tax planning. How do they do something which doesn't have an unintended consequence? And obviously the unintended consequence there is actually we just move the dirty business somewhere else and we don't want to do it here. So there's a big picture that you kind of have to look at, which is why on climate, we always have to move through things on a global scale to try and avoid competing effectively on environmental legislation. Sorry if that was...
So do you want to talk about the business case as well?
Most
Public sector
properties,
business case.
does the army pay the bill, or is it the people who occupy the building who pay the bill? And is it staff accommodation and they pay the bill, or is it the army itself picks up the bill? So when... Sorry, I work in the property industry,
the army
and
pays
it's...
the bill, so if you're a soldier living in a room in a barracks, you don't pay that bill.
So
So that's being thought of, and swipe cards like in hotels, but it's cultural change, isn't it? And money for a meter in everybody's room. So in effect, we're thinking of changing the standards. You know, why should the standard be that you get a room this big with all these extra, you know, even to the extent why does everybody need an ensuite? Because actually the more important standard is the energy efficiency standard.
But doesn't that mean that you can set your own criteria of how much you heat the room and all of those parameters attached to it? So I don't think the age of the stock shouldn't affect too much. So I did a big piece of work with London Fire Brigade looking at micro renewables and energy efficiency across that stock. So that was stock from 1870s right the way up to present day. And there wasn't a denotion in terms of age and energy efficiency in those buildings at all. So we had some old buildings from the 1890s that were absolutely fantastic, very energy efficient, with some buildings from the 2000s that were very energy efficient. We also some absolutely appalling buildings from the 2000s that leaked like a sieve, and ditto from older buildings as well.
Was that related to design or just maintenance?
It was related to both. So there was elements in terms of the original design and the way that it was set up. There was a lot of it that was related to what window types had been put in and how those windows had been maintained. So a lot of it was heat loss from windows, systems that weren't necessarily working together and so on. So there's lots, the older the buildings are, the more that you have those interlinkages to start to have a look at as well. At the end of the day, a building is a holistic system. It's not just a boiler and a chiller and some lighting and some people. They all work and interact together. So you have to look at it as a one whole mechanism because they all fire off each other as well. Yep, yes.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, I was quite interested, a little story really, about heating MOD buildings. The ventilation systems are still calibrated for pre-smoking bans. So they have to suck, they're still sucking through the smoking rate rather than you're not allowed to smoke.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's like, oh my God. So there are lots of...
Yes. Yeah.
Nuances.
Interesting you talk about the carbon tax as well, because I guess when you look at the country's carbon factor, year on year, the number of renewables coming into the system is actually reducing the carbon factor of the country. And so actually going from thinking about energy to thinking just about carbon could have an effect of, we'll just wait and see what the grid does to reduce, because then if the grid is becoming more low carbon, then that means the individuals don't have to do as much if they're basing it around electricity consumption as well.
Yeah, so we've been having a sort of, I suppose it's I've been on the edges of this debate about what an effective target is.
Mm.
We always used to say, us in the army, that we should have a carbon target because that's what we're trying to reduce. But I'm sort of coming to the idea of that an energy target is better, because let's just aim to have to be able to deal with something which we don't have too much to deal with, i.e. the energy, rather than carbon. If we're using lots of energy, we have to deal with it by having lots of renewables and lots of energy and lots of problems. So the net zero thing seems to me the best solution. So I'm coming round to the idea that an energy target is better than a carbon, a grid energy, fossil fuel is better than a carbon target, if that makes sense.
Sure.
In February, what we do, we realized that, we were in control period, and over the last control period, we set a carbon target, right? And before the end of the control period, the carbon target was surpassed without us doing anything.
Yeah. And did you take credit for that?
What we looked at doing, what target we've set this time period round, or this control period, was both a carbon target with an energy efficiency target as well. Because then we can get the individuals within the group to start actually doing things to reduce their energy rather than just constantly the carbon target itself.
I think it's a good point because there can be some perversions in the system. I certainly have one client who has a CHP, and obviously the business case from his point of view to actually insulate his building has kind of collapsed. He says, why do I bother? I've got more heat than I know what to do with as it is. So why do I worry about having double glazing and insulating my building? So it is, he still does it as it happens because he says it's a good thing to do. But there is certainly the business case is quite a struggle in that context.
So yeah, in the middle, yeah.
There's some simple ways when it comes to actually dealing with energy in buildings, just as taking into account the age of the building or its fabric, but the actually is what is put into that building. For example, you put curtains in, carpets, furniture, all of which has an impact on the amount of heat loss from the building itself. So some very simple measures, permanent measures of low cost can actually make something energy savings you look at it. Again, in terms of carbon versus other fuels, got to remember that not only carbon is an issue, but of course things like sulfur dioxide, acid rain and so forth, NOx, also needs to be looked into. So really, it's more of an energy solution rather than just a carbon solution.
And I think certainly regulation is going that way. So Europe as a whole is moving towards having a twin carbon and energy philosophy. For those same reasons, we're decarbonising the grid consistently. The carbon emissions, carbon factor for UK has dropped 46% from 2010. So in theory, if you'd done nothing at all, you'd have said, hey, I've almost halved my carbon emissions. Aren't I great? And actually, we want to be trying to reduce the kilowatt hours that are being consumed as well, because we know there's an overconsumption of that part. If you turn around and say, we've already met our targets by not doing anything, what's the messaging that we're giving to senior management? The messaging in senior management is, great, well, I don't need to approve any budgets for you, then do I? Because you're going to meet your target without spending anything. So give all the money back again.
I'm going to have to defend carbon-intensive industry, not carbon-intensive, energy-intensive industries, a different thing here. Yeah. So now, one of the things government is going to do is change to a primary energy metric. So what that actually means is changing to accounting for how much power you take from the grid. So you could still be an energy-intensive industry as long as you're not pulling power necessarily from the grid, which might therefore be carbon-intensive. So the idea is to move towards renewables.
Okay, we're pretty much towards the end of this session. Any final questions, comments from the floor? Yeah.
Yes, I'm grateful if you could outline one of the key things that an ordinary company needs to put into its annual report in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of carbon trading, and how you want to determine that.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. I understand that companies in general, in terms of annual reports, I mentioned it in the slide
Okay,
above,
yeah.
have to report on what they're doing. What information does a company, is a company required to specify in its annual report nowadays? And how do you determine?
Okay.
So that's the SEC, yeah.
Yeah, so the
It's
process
just coming
is
in,
changing.
isn't it?
Yeah, the process is changing in April
Yeah.
to the simplified
Energy
energy
and carbon
carbon
reporting.
reporting. Go on, you carry on then.
Yeah, so the SECR, which will come out, so that's for your financial year. So it goes into the annual report. There is a strict set of information that you need to be including in there. So my first reference is go back to the government sets of information. But a lot of what the intention from government is saying, do you know how much energy, CO2, GHG that you're producing? So there's some form of data collection and some form of validation that needs to go along as part of that. If you want to take an extra step to get it externally verified, that's your choice. There's no requirement to do that. But there certainly should be some internal validation that takes place. So you can talk about what you've done to make sure that it's accurate. You talk about the scope of the information that's been included. It needs to include transport as well. But again, there's a grey area associated with what level of transport do you and don't you include as part of that. You also need to start to talk about what measures you're going to be looking into the future. So this is saying next year we're going to do X, which forms the basis of what you're going to be reporting on next year. So it sets the scene and it sets expectations of how far you're going to be going. So that way, again, you're managing what level of savings, improvements, etc. that might come through. If you're at the early stages, you might be talking about getting better data. So it could be putting metering in there, improving the accuracy of the data and the information that you're getting through to be able to make business cases. If you've got all the data, it's already accurate, you might be saying, we're going to be rolling out energy efficiency lighting to come in, other projects, and here's the expected savings that will come through.
And what's this called, please? It comes in April?
Yes, SECR, so it's Simplified Energy and Carbon Reporting.
Simplified energy and carbon
So,
reporting.
Yeah.
And the step forward with it is the idea that you've got to do this forward look in essence of what measures. So in terms of energy efficiency, the hope is that it will actually drive something, because most people don't really want to say in their next annual report, well, actually, we didn't do anything. Or we're worse than we were before. So they're hoping it's a bit of a name and shame in a way.
Yeah. As it's directed, it has to be signed off by them, which means it's got the additional security. So if you put information in there that's not correct, in theory, you get kicked out of the company's house.
Okay, we'll end this session on that note. If you can thank the panel, please, in the normal way.